All right, thank you, Rennie, for that intro. It's nice to be back, coming at you live from sunny New York City. And we've got quite an agenda for you all today, just talking about enterprise blockchains and their various forms and what the crazy sci-fi future of them and the future of the firm could be. So just to get into the details of what today is going to be about, first we're going to begin with some background on the token frenzy, this whole blockchain bonanza going on right now that you've probably read and heard about at Thanksgiving dinner and what's happened since then. Then we're going to move into the new wave of IT services and how crypto networks can offer alternatives to many centralized services today. And then we're going to get into some crazy sci-fi ideas of what the future of the decentralized organization could look like. But to begin, on the blockchain frenzy that you probably know well, really this whole revolution kicked off with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is one of the first blockchains, but really undergirding it is this idea of peer-to-peer usage that nobody can really control or censor. So nobody can say that you cannot transfer money to a certain person. And the idea there behind that is often called censorship resistant. But that whole idea really took hold with the wrong crowd. And about 2012, 2013, you really saw this coming to light in the news with Silk Road being shut down. And so the initial success of blockchain and the Bitcoin blockchain was really used for skullduggery and some unsavory things with some unsavory people. So banks really couldn't touch it for the longest time. But really, like I said, undergirding it is this transferable technology of blockchain, which at its core is about a database where untrusted parties come together in agreement on the state of that database, and there is no middleman to talk to. So you can see that the recent hype around blockchain has meant that all sorts of different companies are talking about it. So this is a look at mentions of blockchain on corporate earnings calls, publicly traded companies in America. You can see that we have seen some incredible hype coming into fruition. Early 2018, pretty much continued in Q2 this year. This is actually on everybody's radar right now. And you can see from an investment standpoint, this is also very much true. You can see that we've had deals ebb and flow into that peak hype towards the end of the year. Deals kind of slowed down, but the money did, and you can see that enormous ICO raised by EOS and a couple other big ones that have contributed to a serious amount of funding going on, and people speculating that this could be the next big thing. But really, this whole conversation about blockchain is part of a larger one around collaborative databases. And there's different versions. There's distributed ledgers, which are administered, permissioned, and maybe more known for being used in-house at big companies like Walmart and Maersk. Right now, these are pilot stage ideas. People wondering, how can we take these innovations of distributed ledgers and apply them, to our proprietary data? And then on the other end, there's more public, permissionless blockchains that are completely decentralized. So a lot of these are kind of coming into the scope of crypto networks, more along the lines of Bitcoin, Filecoin, 0x, things that publicly float, nobody really owns, and are creating some sort of value as a network. And we'll get into the distinction a little more later on. But at any rate, there is tons of corporate interest around this. So here's just an excerpt from a recent Amazon patent talking about a service that could potentially flag Bitcoins being transferred for law enforcement who wanted to use its imagined streaming platform. And then there's also that big news recently that Amazon, much like IBM or Oracle have done in the past, is going to begin to offer blockchain services that compete and maybe sort of a way to keep people in the fold of AWS. Instead of going out and outsourcing your blockchain service with IBM, now you already have your services with AWS. It's just another reason to stay in the fold. And you can see that corporate interest is starting to brew. And likewise, those internal projects that I was talking about are starting to be tested. And you can see Maersk with Hyperledger, Walmart with Hyperledger. Actually, the Maersk joint venture is pretty interesting. It's not named. Nobody really knows exactly how it's going to work yet, but the idea, we know at least, is to help shippers, ports, banks, other stakeholders really replace and automate the pencil and paper, the vast amounts of paperwork that go into making sure containers and shipping in general is done by who says it is, and things actually move to where they're supposed to be. And you can obviously imagine that because of the limitations of that, there's perishable goods laying in wait to spoil, and there's tons of externalities and things that just are never tracked. Similarly with Walmart and the Hyperledger that it's testing, they initially used its distributed ledger fabric to track food in the supply chain and basically be able to recall food really quickly. So that's one area where the transparency of blockchain is being tested out. And there was that headline not too long ago about how it was able to track pigs from China as they moved from the supply chain there all the way to the American table. And this is also starting to take hold with heavier industry names like UPS, FedEx, BNSF Railway, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Schneider Trucking. There's 200 plus names that are part of this new consortium called BETA, or the Blockchain and Transport Alliance. And you can see that people are trying to band together to make sense of this technology. And doing so together is very important because, as Matt Levine points out, you do not quite get the benefits of trustless decentralization if each company is making its own proprietary blockchain. So that familiar coordination problem is starting to take hold. You know, if everybody is just making their own siloed database, you just have a slightly better siloed database. There is no data sharing going on. The real benefits of seamless integration along the many stakeholders in, say, a supply chain, those aren't being helped in any way. And you know, that whole idea is also applied to the way computing works. Centralization in general is often faster, and users are difficult to manage, like I was saying. But there are new applications where this can help the enterprise, and we're starting to see some early action in a couple areas like identity, Office dApps, and the IT stack, kind of more on the enterprise end. And then there's other non-financial blockchains like in energy grids, in the supply chain, and industrial cybersecurity. So finance really gets a lot of hype for being, you know, the true use case for the blockchain world. And so far that seems to be pretty well proven just by the market caps of Bitcoin, Ethereum, some of those bigger names out there. But the technology is starting to at least take hold in some of these select areas, and we're definitely watching what else comes out of that. But if you want to take a look at some of those areas, I have linked here. Banking is only the beginning. We have some other content related to corporations that are piloting this as well. But to begin, you know, some companies that are gaining traction in the area at least is in identity. The whole idea in your life might be the same way as mine, that your entire identity more or less lies within Google and Facebook. You know, it would be a real problem as an internet user if those were to go away tomorrow. But the idea is that the ownerless, more or less non-corporate version of a online identity can be done by Civic, can be done by Uport. And as you surf the internet, you might be able to port your data from one to another without having to change passwords, and really having complete ownership about how your data is handled by maybe a future company. And similarly, you can kind of think of the enterprise software being done in this decentralized fashion with Telegram, say. I like to think of it as a decentralized Slack, an ownerless HipChat. There's the idea for like an internet relay chat is obviously very old, but all of them are coming from centralized companies. Telegram is in a way ownerless, and a similar idea is being tested now with Graphite, which is, for lack of a better way of describing, Google Docs for this decentralized web. There's other ideas like Gitcoin that are much like GitHub, except ownerless and decentralized. and you kind of get the idea for how the future of what you use on your office, your work laptop, could be done by a decentralized blockchain or a ledger service of some sort. Same is also true in the IT stack. You have interplanetary file system, which is more or less a decentralized way of storing stuff on the web. Right now you probably use Amazon Web Services. S3 is a very common way to store your web files, or Dropbox is another one. Golem is another similar project that's doing that, but for compute. So there is other applications in the heavy industry areas where this is also starting to make sense. So, for example, energy trading is very much a peer-to-peer thing. As energy grids become less centralized and people start getting more comfortable with the idea of selling, say, their excess solar energy to their neighbor, the tracking and transparency part is going to be a challenge and also going to be a very necessary thing for that network to grow. So some companies that are looking to tackle that, and an area that we've seen plenty of traction in is with energy grids. So LO3, Grid Plus, these are the types of companies that are trying to be, that application layer, that thing that people use to exchange with one another. Similarly, blockchain and ledgers and blockchains for supply chain, similar idea to like the Maersk or Walmart pilots that are going on. How do we exploit the innovations of blockchain to be done, instead of talking about who's transferring what money to what wallet? Instead, we're talking about the movement of goods from one supplier to another. And you can see how that makes sense. Definitely in a space to watch. And then certainly industrial cybersecurity. So a lot of the encryption innovations are being reapplied to cybersecurity. And as you might know, with hack after hack, like WannaCry affecting a company as large as Boeing, for example, you can see why people are desperate to find any solution that might be able to help these large malware problem that's going on, and especially at an industrial scale. So industrial networks are often very much critical infrastructure. If we weren't to have goods or utilities for 5+ days at a time, it would be utter chaos. So there's definitely a market to be found for reapplying these innovations for industrial cybersecurity. So Zage is one company to watch there. Filament, you might know. Guard Time, actually working with the Department of Energy on the security side. And you can see that these are definitely legitimate ideas that are being pursued by some big names, at least for the pilot stage that we're in right now. But there's also a whole new wave of crypto networks, a slightly different variety, that offer a new wave of IT services as well. So I think what best gets this idea, and I was talking about it a little bit earlier with Filecoin, if you might best understand it as Airbnb, but for file storage. There is, for example, if you have extra hardware laying around at home, you might be able to hook it up and get compensated for you contributing to the network by storing someone else's files. You can think of it maybe as BitTorrent, where you're actually compensated for, BitTorrent or Napster, where you're actually compensated for your contributions. And that whole idea, that whole concept of kickstarting network effects is being reappropriated to pretty much every industry you can think of, and a lot of crypto networks are popping up to basically be stakeholder-owned companies of the future. And a lot of this is being kickstarted with tokens and economics that incentivize people to contribute to the network. So you can see how that's being done in a variety of different angles. There's Bitcoin with store of value, there's Filecoin with file storage, identity, social media, collectibles, advertising platforms, and so much more. It's really just the beginning, but you can see how this also puts some centralized services maybe in the crosshairs. So Filecoin, Golem, for example, are more or less ownerless versions of S3 or EC2, which are provided by Amazon Web Services. Now, we've also mapped this entire space before, and this is the entire index on our radar, at least, for companies that have ICOs or initial coin offerings where they set up a token that floats freely, and it can be earned in certain ways or in certain ways of contribution on its network. So this ranges all the way from decentralized exchanges, infrastructure plays, marketplaces, prediction markets. There's all sorts of new crowdfunding, so a decentralized Kickstarter sort of idea, and you can so on and so on. You can see how this powerful idea is starting to take hold, and how crypto networks might be able to evolve into something that's more like a trust or a co-op or an ownerless sort of company. And that kind of brings me to the future of the decentralized org. Now, this is going to be a little crazier, so bear with me and be ready for some pretty crazy ideas. So, you can more or less understand today's internet companies as owners of valuable databases. So the power of most web companies comes from controlling the database and getting to decide who sees which part and when. So, for example, conversations on the web, pretty much done on Twitter. Link sharing and commenting, that database is pretty much owned by Reddit. So what a lot of people are asking right now in the blockchain world is, what do ownerless versions of this look like? And with that, right now a lot of people, especially the American public, are starting to turn their backs on those centralized tech platforms. 72% of Americans think it's likely that social media platforms censor their viewpoints. So you can see why this idea of a decentralized web service might be attractive, because in many ways it's ownerless and unstoppable. So you can take a look at on the left. This is Steemit, which rewards its users for posting, and it rewards them in their Steem cryptocurrency. It vests in many ways, kind of like stock does. You have to hold on to it for 2 years, and basically it pays its content creators, the people who post, kind of like YouTube pays people who get millions of views. And similarly, the concept's being applied for a decentralized version of Twitter, which is Peepeth. Really what it does is it claims to be unstoppable and uncensorable. Right now you actually have to pay a tiny microtransaction to post, and that's what keeps it free. But you can see that nobody can really mess with it once it's written. It's forever on the blockchain. And what's also interesting about Peepeth, you can see that it's powered by that interplanetary file service that I mentioned before. That's just par for the course of what this decentralized future could be like. It's a decentralized service using the backend, on the backend at least, a decentralized service that someone else has. And you can imagine maybe the future is a lot of different services cobbled together. And that idea is maybe best put to words recently, actually last night, by Naval Ravikant, a pretty noted blockchain investor. He said, quote, "A firm is just a nexus of contracts. Payroll contracts with employees, profit contracts with shareholders, debt contracts, and so on. And blockchain-based smart contracts will eventually reinvent the firm as we know it. And that firm will often, or most likely, be written into code somehow." So the future of the firm is going to be decentralized and obliterated, at least in the eyes of some people who are kind of out there, but also very much sincere investors in the space. So you can see that whole idea maybe could be done with a real world tangible business as well. So that idea is being tested out here with Helium's new pivot. So Helium more or less started as middleware for IoT. This recent pivot is kind of putting to words what I was saying before about obliterating the firm. The idea here with its new IoT service is that much like Bitcoin rewards people who mine its currency, by more or less turning electricity into a useful service for the network, the same idea, the same concept of the Bitcoin blockchain is being applied to IoT coverage, more or less being a telecom. So if you have some extra electricity and you want to contribute to this telecom and get compensated for it, you can get this new gateway and essentially help create a big mesh network going on to bring IoT coverage into a full-scale network. And the idea is that the token that you might get will incentivize you to stay there as it appreciates, and then also you'll be compensated in the short term as well. Similar ideas being done with decentralized protocols. You can think of maybe 0x as a tool that will help create a decentralized ownerless Coinbase. This one is done for doing on-chain settlement, mostly Ethereum tokens, ERC20 tokens for now. I think a similar idea for obliterating the firm as we know it is maybe done with by the Ocean protocol. You can think of that, or actually just think about today's version of corporate partnerships. You have your legal people talk to their legal people. It's a dragged out 6-month affair. You stipulate which data can be shared for this partnership, which can't. So say you're a company with a vast trove of training data for computer vision on autonomous vehicles. And your plan is not to necessarily do just your own company. Maybe you want to sling that data elsewhere and see what it's worth in the open market. Well, on this blockchain, you'll be able to publish which data you want to share with people, and then also written into the blockchain, have stipulations for how it can be treated. Say you don't want it to be done for military use, for example. That's written in stone. And then you can more or less hit the free market and have partnerships that don't have these dragged out legal affairs, and everything's done in a seamless and cryptographically enabled way. That's sort of the future we're talking about. And even maybe one crazier is this idea of a blockchain state, as in a digital jurisdiction. So this company, Aragon, probably well known in the scene, but has this really interesting idea. They often talk about this potential entrepreneur, maybe born into a country like Venezuela, who's a talented programmer, wants to start a company, but realizes the barriers to entry are so great, and that there's this distributed workforce that they would want to hire, but they can't, that it really would make sense to start a company on a blockchain from the ground up. And so what this company provides is an entity whose capitalization, the cap table is going to be on the blockchain. There's governance, there's payroll, basically all the legal stuff that goes into company creation, what you send to Delaware to be handled. All of that could be done and managed by smart contracts. And the company actually has tools for governance, for payroll, for accounting, and all sorts of different stuff. And to take it even one further, maybe the future of the firm could be down to the people, day-to-day kind of stuff could be written into code as well. So Colony's not yet done its crowd sale, but is starting to do some more hackathons and trying to piece together what it could be. But the idea, at least right now, is that the internal politics, basically performance reviews, the HR, the getting people to do stuff in the real world while managing this completely code-based company, that you're going to need some method in place. And Colony allows companies to do this at scale and have its own token in between. But it's still very much a radical idea. Has not been released yet. But just a sampler platter of some ideas about how the future of the firm could be undone in a way, and could be complementary as well to many existing enterprises. So it's not necessarily a competition thing. These things may be more complementary than we imagine. But that's just the ideas that I wanted to bring for you all today, and this is really what the Vanguard is starting to think about. So with that, I'm going to take a couple moments, collect some of your questions, and hopefully I'll be able to get you something back in just a moment. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so somebody's asking, do you foresee any disruptions in the underlying IT infrastructure? Example of networking, perhaps, that could be brought about by increasing adoption of the blockchain. I'm not an expert on how the internet infrastructure is handling all this, but I do imagine that this could be done relatively seamlessly even on today's networks. The networking gear, the latencies that people talk about are also constantly changing. So, for example, 5G is very much hyped in my other area of expertise with IoT as being, more or less higher throughput on every dimension from what we do. As networking improves on its own, I'm not too concerned, especially just by how nascent blockchain is today. I don't think any of your friends are on blockchain-based social networks right now, and mine aren't either. But so by that I mean this is still very much early innings for all this, and at the same time, networking is going to be increasing at such an insane rate in the next 10, 20 years that it's probably not going to be a bottleneck for now. What is it? What do you see as the most relevant current initiative for blockchain in the healthcare space? Actually, on my past webinar, I talked in some greater depth about companies like Hashed Health or Evernym that are really just trying to put patient records, citizen records onto the blockchain. I think just having a HIPAA compliant blockchain would be really crazy, but I don't know if that's at all tenable at this point. But yeah, that's generally, the data sharing within healthcare is notoriously bad. Extremely siloed data. We're talking to the hospital level. There's no data sharing due to HIPAA compliance. So maybe if the regulations change, I could envision more sharing going on, more blockchain-based things. But even still, it's being piloted right now by a couple prominent hospitals, projects like I think Evernym was working with the state of Illinois, my home state. So it's pretty interesting to watch. Still, definitely the word is out on that. What is your read on the regulatory support and adoption for blockchain outside of cryptocurrencies? Well, I can tell you firsthand that it's going better than you might imagine. We recently had the Future of FinTech for CV Insights clients, as well as almost 1,000 people here in New York City, and I got a little taste of what is being talked about even at institutional big conservative funds. People are starting to approach investors for ideas about what this really means, and I think there's just if that's even happening, there's an air of legitimacy going on, and I think just by all the posturing by the SEC to more or less recently declare that Ethereum was not a security. I think you're starting to see that regulators really are trying their best to take this seriously while also respecting the innovation going on as well, and not trying to be too clamped down on it. So I think that it's top of mind for the Justice Department, for the SEC. I think that just goes to show you that there is more legitimacy than there's ever been, and if you look at all the big names getting involved from Amazon, Facebook, and others who are offering services of this kind for people to test out, there's definitely something here. People don't really know, what's going to hit, but people are trying to sling and see what can be achieved. And I think the regulators especially are sensitive to that. Let's see. How do you see the supply chain ideas evolve, and when do you think the tech will mature? 3 to 5 years? I'd say that sounds about accurate. I think right now, and something that always concerns me is the connectivity and the actual hardware verification, especially in the supply chain. It's one thing to have a better database, and I'm sure Maersk or Walmart have their share of databases and oracles and SAPs to keep track of which stuff is where. But at the same time, all that data means nothing if you don't have an actual IoT device there to verify that the thing is where we think it is. And that last mile of where stuff is often tagged with RFID or other forms of IoT. And getting that to be cryptographically secure is a really interesting technical problem to have. I thought what Helium is doing and what I was talking about before with that IoT telecom, it's going to require stuff like that to be popularized to really make this seamless, perfect supply chain world actually come into fruition. And so I'm looking for companies like that. I think Cartosite is an interesting one, trying to do more stuff there. Tive is another one to check out. I mean, these are not really on IoT bands. They're oftentimes using cellular bands to transmit data. But at the same time, I think to just verify what stuff is where is going to be the biggest bottleneck, and making sure that these blockchains have good data going in. Otherwise, it's kind of a useless innovation on the database. So that's something I'm looking out for personally. Let's see. Okay, so who will run the blockchains? Isn't it dangerous with such control of data? Isn't that decentralized? What's the flip side of a blockchain? Well, there's obviously flip sides to all these technologies. So one of them, maybe to use the example of PPIF before, that decentralized version of Twitter, the benefit here is that it's completely censorship resistant. Nobody can really erase this. No, if there's a tweet that the government doesn't like, they can't go, subpoena PPIF and get this thing removed. That's just not possible, because every computer who contributes to this network, or even the interplanetary file exchange, is going to have a version of this PPIF with that unsavory tweet in there. At the same time, though, what's a great part of being a centralized Twitter, for example, twitter.com, is that you can have actual methods in place to deal with abusive tweets, stuff like that would violate norms that people want to have for their networks. So that governance aspect gets harder as you have no owner. The more distributed you get, the more decentralized you get, the more the problems of what to do to govern this platform we have become more nebulous. And that's just like that can be generalized to almost all these blockchain crypto networks. The ownership aspect gets a little fuzzier. What do we do? How do we govern? How do we decide, to do a pivot if this thing isn't catching? A lot of these might just kind of fall apart from never having agreement, or just doing nothing and becoming bad places to go to. So until PPIF is, maybe a better product than Twitter, you're not gonna see a lot of people on there. But that whole incentive mechanism to get people kickstarted, to get people to contribute and build a network effect, that's kind of the carrot versus the stick. What's gonna really bring people together to make good networks? Are you seeing any new companies focused on real estate transactions on the blockchain? This is more than just tokenizing the entire industry. Harbor is definitely a big company to watch. From David Sachs, longtime entrepreneur, big Silicon Valley name. He is now trying to tokenize all of real estate, much like Wall Street does regularly. And kind of banding it together and having that data structured on a blockchain. A really interesting company to watch. It's $1 trillion industry. There's that whole idea of tokenizing stocks as well as another dream that's kind of in the same vein, and just having everything run on the seamless, middleman-less exchange. Certainly a dream people are having. That's more on the end of the financial blockchains, which is a subject for a different webinar. But definitely company to watch. Harbor, again, is the name. Are there companies that have used these platforms to run a business, as in a blockchain-based company? I think this what this user's asking is, are people using this stuff? Are these legitimate projects? Are these companies actually using this internally? and does it make business sense? Well, I think, for example, what I was pointing to before with PPIF using interplanetary file service, the future could be cobbled together from a bunch of different services that I was mentioning before. You could have little identity login written by Civic. You might have the payment portion handled by a payment service like MetaMask or something like that. You can cobble together clones and also entirely new services that we haven't dreamed up yet, using all these remixed services together. So while you might not replace PayPal on your website to collect payments just yet, but if it's no skin off of your back, you might think about doing it once the equivalent on the blockchain is done, and you're realizing that you're just turning away customers by not having it on there. In some respects, in a couple of years from now, 5, 10, definitely, you might see that not participating and being blind to this technology is really just turning away dollars and customers. And the same might be true for people who are trying to create ownerless companies. You want to basically eat the lunch of a centralized service. You might be able to do so by cobbling together these services. All right, I'm getting the sign that I need to get off of this for now, but I do want to continue the conversation on Twitter. I'm at npapag, N-P-A-P-P-A-G, Nick Papa George here, and I would love to continue the conversation. This is, of course, very interesting to me as somebody who has a foot in the heavy stuff world. I cover a lot of hardware, IoT related things, robotics as well, and then also have a foot into the blockchain space. It's really interesting for me to hear your perspectives on how this is actually taking off on the ground. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to hearing what you all think. Thanks again.